So now we turn to Kant's Categorical Imperative. He begins by looking at moral worth, and he explicitly rejects utilitarianism by asserting that the moral worth of an action is not based on its effect, not even, a principle of action motivated by the expected effect. So his view is against utilitarianism. His reason for this is he asserts that all these positive effects and promotion of happiness could be caused in other ways, and there'd be no need for the will of a rational being. And for him, there is a clear necessity that a rational being be involved to make things, ethical or immoral. So, as we saw before for him, the supreme and unconditional good lies only in his goodwill. And in what does this goodness of the goodwill consist? Well, according to him, it consists in the conception of law. And so, when deciding, is the will good or not, it is a matter of, is the conception of law determining, the will, or is it the expected effect? And for Kant, what matters is the conception of law. And he notes, correctly, that in terms of acting on a conception of law, only rational beings can do this, because only they can understand the law and elect to act upon the law or break it. Objects, of course, in Kant's view, do follow laws as well, but they don't have any choice. To use an example, if someone's on top of a building and they, push something off to try and hit someone else, they're making a decision to do that. But the object they push off, following the law of gravity, but it makes no choice. So why does Kant think that it's the will itself that matters and not the consequences? What he claims is this: as soon as you make the decision to follow the law or not follow the law, the good is already present in you, and there's no need to wait to see it appear in the outcome. To use an analogy, if you're familiar at all with BioWare's games, so the company that makes games like Neverwinter Nights, more famously, of course, Bioshock, the various versions of that, Knights of the Old Republic, etc. And they often have their a moral system in their game. They might call it, like in Star Wars games, light side, dark side, Paragon, and etc. And so the idea is, as soon as you make your choice, you kind of get your points for being good or bad. You don't have to wait around for the consequences. To use that kind of model, it's like ethics works like this. Every time we're into a scenario, you can imagine, like in a video game, you get like a choice wheel or menu options. And then as soon as you pick it, as soon as you click that choice, you're either good or bad. You don't have to wait for the outcome, at least according to Kant. So the law then is really important for him. So conforming one's will to the law, it doesn't mean like human law. It doesn't mean you have to like always obey the state. He means the moral law. So that is supposed to be the principle. And so he lays out kind of the initial version of the categorical imperative, which is this. It involves determining how to act. And he says this: I am never to act otherwise than so that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. What does he mean? Well, in this case, a maxim is a self-given, self-interested permission to take action. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying to myself that I can do this, I'm the one giving permission to myself, and it's aimed at my own self-interest. The universal law is, in a way, kind of self-explanatory. It is the law for everyone. And so his test would be this. If I want to do something, I would ask myself, could this become universal law? So roughly put, I'm saying, okay, I can do this if I'm willing to allow that everyone can do this as well. So why accept this as true? Well, he has a pretty short proof. He says, in many ways similar to Mill, he just says the common reason of men perfectly coincides with this, which is, as you might imagine, can be debated. Kant then goes on to give an example to illustrate how his system works. And the example he chooses is this. He asks us to imagine a scenario in which he is in distress and must make a promise while intending not to keep it. And he says this raises two questions. First, is it prudent, which is a matter of practicality? Second, is it right, which is a matter of ethics? And as he notes, it's rather different to be truthful from duty, to do so out of ethics, than to be truthful simply out of fear for the consequences. So he asserts that breaking the principle of duty would be wicked, and ignoring his maxim of prudence, that is to say, if it would be more likely that something, bad would happen if he did it, then that would be, not very safe to break it. But it could be advantageous to lie. So one is a consideration of ethics, one a consideration of practical consequences. So how do we know what to do? Now, in the case of pragmatics, it's as Kant acknowledges, it's a pretty straightforward calculation of advantage versus risk. But what about the moral aspect? How do you know whether it's morally okay to make a lying promise? Well, this is what he claims works. So you'd ask yourself this: should I accept that my maxim, in this case, that when I need to lie and I can't fulfill the promise, that I can do so? Can I make that into a universal law for myself and others? Essentially, it would be, I would say that everyone can make a deceitful promise when they find themselves in a difficulty they can't get out of except for lying. So what does Kant conclude? So Kant concludes this. He concludes that he cannot will that lying be a universal law. Why not? Well, his reasoning is that it would be self-destructive, because in that case there would be no promises, since no one would believe promises. And so the maxim would be self-destructive. It'd be necessarily self-defeating. Because if I'm telling a lie to gain an advantage, but if the universal law was everyone can lie, lying would be useless, because no one would believe anyone. And as a side note, in a way, it's this will sound kind of weird, but it's heartening to see that lying still works. And the reason why is because, as Kant points out, if lying was generally accepted, lying would stop working. So as long as lying still works, oddly enough, then most people are still honest. Could be wrong about that, but perhaps that is the case. So his test essentially is this, to determine the good. Using his language, he says, "Canst thou also will that thy maxim should be a universal law? If not, you have to reject it as bad, not because of the disadvantage, but because he thinks it can't be a universal law. And if you can make it into a universal law through this rational, kind of thought process, then it would be acceptable. So crudely put, it's okay for you to do something if you're willing to allow everyone else to do the same thing. And if you're not willing to do that, then it would be wrong." And he does require that it be a matter of rationality, because there would be the obvious problem of people who are like just, psychotic or, insane, etc. So in terms of what duty is for him, he believes it is the necessity of acting from pure respect for the practical law. And again, here by practical law, he doesn't mean like practical in the sense of being very useful and getting everyday projects done. He means essentially the moral law. And he claims that this is the only motive, because all other motives must yield to this, because getting back to the goodwill, it is the condition of the goodwill, and its worth is above everything. So far he's kind of roughed out his, he hasn't named it yet, roughed out, he will later, soon, call the categorical imperative. Now we actually reach the categorical imperative, his central defining moral principle. Now, as I noted earlier in the introduction to Kant's deontology, Kant held that everything in nature works in accord with laws. So his view is that there are laws of nature, which is a debate in metaphysics, philosophy of science, and of course science. Namely, are there laws that run reality? Now, one thing that we've got as rational beings is a will, which allows us to act in accord with a conception of laws, but also, of course, to explicitly break them. And so we're different from merely physical objects in the sense that there are certain laws, namely the moral laws, that we can choose to follow or choose to break. In contrast, physical objects, acting as physical objects, can't break the laws of reality. So they have to follow those rules. So what about this categorical imperative thing? Well, Kant begins by talking about imperatives. And imperatives, of course, are commands. And he splits imperatives into two flavors, hypothetical and categorical. The hypothetical imperatives are those that are used when the action is good only as a means to something else. So it'd be hypothetical. If you want this, then do that. For example, if you want to make money, buy low, sell high. If you want to get better at a sport, do more of the sport, practice. The categorical, though, he says, is conceived as good in itself and is necessarily the principle of a will which conforms to reason. So categorical is non-hypothetical. Instead of, if you want this, then do that, it's simply do this. And to not do it would be wrong. So what is his famous categorical imperative? Well, here's the wording. Act only on that maxim, whereby thou canst, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. And he also throws in the imperative of duty. Act as if the maxim of the action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. So what he's doing here essentially is running the test we saw before, which is, okay, suppose we run into a scenario where I'm wondering, should I do something or not? And suppose I'm, considering cheating at a video game, getting a hack or a mod. And then my maxim would be, when I want to win more, I shall cheat by hacking or modding. And then the question would be, could I will that to be universal law, that everyone gets to hack or mod? And the answer, of course, would be no, because I can't will that to be a law that everyone, could follow, that it would become okay to do that, because I would aim to cheat to get an advantage. But if everyone's, cheating, and cheating, I guess, is well or better than I am, then I would have no advantage. And so it would be self-defeating. So I can't make it into a universal law. Again, he does put a limit on it in terms of, it's got to be rationally willed. So someone who's, psychotic or something, they're presumably disqualified from such willing. He then heads into some examples, 4 examples to illustrate his categorical imperative. Now we actually reach the categorical imperative, his central defining moral principle. Now, as I noted earlier in the introduction to Kant's deontology, Kant held that everything in nature works in accord with laws. So his view is that there are laws of nature, which is a debate in metaphysics, philosophy of science, and of course science. Namely, are there laws that run reality? Now, one thing that we've got as rational beings is a will, which allows us to act in accord with a conception of laws, but also, of course, to explicitly break them. And so we're different from merely physical objects in the sense that there are certain laws, namely the moral laws, that we can choose to follow or choose to break. In contrast, physical objects, acting as physical objects, can't break the laws of reality. So they have to follow those rules. So what about this categorical imperative thing? Well, Kant begins by talking about imperatives. And imperatives, of course, are commands. And he splits imperatives into two flavors, hypothetical and categorical. The hypothetical imperatives are those that are used when the action is good only as a means to something else. So it'd be hypothetical. If you want this, then do that. For example, if you want to make money, buy low, sell high. If you want to get better at a sport, do more of the sport, practice. The categorical, though, he says, is conceived as good in itself and is necessarily the principle of a will which conforms to reason. So categorical is non-hypothetical. Instead of, if you want this, then do that, it's simply, do this. And to not do it would be wrong. So what is his famous categorical imperative? Well, here's the wording. Act only on that maxim, whereby thou canst, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. And he also throws in the imperative of duty. Act as if the maxim of the action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. So what he's doing here essentially is running the test we saw before, which is, okay, suppose we run into a scenario where I'm wondering, should I do something or not? And suppose I'm, considering cheating at a video game, getting a hack or a mod. And then my maxim would be, when I want to win more, I shall cheat by hacking or modding. And then the question would be, could I will that to be universal law, that everyone gets to hack or mod? And the answer, of course, would be no, because I can't will that to be a law that everyone, could follow, that it would become okay to do that, because I would aim to cheat to get an advantage. But if everyone's, cheating, and cheating, I guess, is well or better than I am, then I would have no advantage. And so it would be self-defeating. So I can't make it into a universal law. Again, he does put a limit on it in terms of, it's got to be rationally willed. So someone who's, psychotic or something, they're presumably disqualified from such willing. He then heads into some examples, 4 examples to illustrate his categorical imperative. Kant's second example is the case of lying promises. And this takes us back to kind of his leading example for the categorical imperative, but it's focusing on the particular reason the person is lying. So as always, in all 3 examples, again, it's situation, the maxim, the test. So the situation is this. A person needs to borrow money because they don't have enough money, and they know that they cannot repay it. But of course, if they go to a bank or somebody and say, hey, can I have some money that I'm never going to repay? The bank is pretty typically going to say no. So he wants to lie to get the money, but is willing to consider whether it's wrong or not. And so applying Kant's categorical imperative, this is what the person would do. They would create a maxim. When I need money, I will borrow it and promise to repay it, though I cannot do so. So that's the maxim. The test would be this. As Kant notes, this may be, depending if one can get away with it or not, it may be prudent, but is it right? And Kant says, no surprise here, no, because it would result in a contradiction. If it's a universal law that everyone could lie, then promising would be impossible, because they would not be believed, and if someone said, I promise, people would just laugh because they would have no value. So in a way, what we're asked to do is kind of imagine an alternative reality. Imagine like a short show, or it being dragged out needlessly into a long movie, where you make like this one change. So imagine we have a world just like ours with one change. Namely, in this world, lying is considered perfectly acceptable. People can lie all the time. Now, in a world where people can lie all the time, and it's considered to be, acceptable, people would not believe promises, because everyone would know that they were effectively meaningless. So this one does seem to to work, given his setup. So that's the second case, lying. And for Kant, lying is always wrong. And again, Kant is an absolutist, so there would be no exceptions. The third case is based on, obviously enough, the parable of the talents. There's a person who's got people working for them. He gives, he's gone out of town. He gives each of them some money. One person gets one talent, which is the unit of money. And the person who gets the one talent hides it under a basket or buries it or something. And then the person, comes back and says, what have you done? And the person says, he just hid it under, a basket or buried it, depending on the version of the story. And of course, the point of the parable is that even if you have but a limited talent, you should, let it shine, let the light shine on it. So Kant is imagining, a very similar situation. Suppose you have a person who has a talent that if they were to actually develop it, it would make them useful in many respects. But the person is, everything is going well for them. So they would rather just indulge in, enjoying themselves rather than taking efforts to improve their ability. To use an example, like many people, I've known people who are really smart and capable, but they would prefer to just, kind of get by. Maybe just live in their parents' basement, playing video games, working a little bit to make some money to buy more video games and, Cheetos and stuff. And they could be so much more, but they're not. They're letting their talents rust. Or you can imagine another kind of, obviously far more unusual case where someone, say, is getting an engineering degree or a medical degree, and they're already doing brilliant things in engineering, developing, say, they develop say a way to make a ventilator, for $30, or they're already developing like a cheap test for COVID, so they're a brilliant person, and then they win the lottery, and they're like, screw this, and they just take their $5 million and just give up. And we might say, well, they're letting their talents rust. So you get a person who could be useful, but they're just going to let their talents rust because everything is going pretty well. They're not hurting anybody. They're just not, developing their talents. So Kant says, let's put this to the test. And the test would be this. The person's maxim is that when someone has a talent that would be very useful, but they don't want to develop it because they'd rather just, enjoy themselves, they can do so. So can this be universalized? Well, Kant says this system of nature could subsist, though people allow their talents to rust and devote themselves to enjoyment. But he claims they can't actually will this to be a universal law of nature. Why not? Well, his critics say he kind of cheats here, and his defenders, of course, say he doesn't. And what he says is this. If you're a rational being, you necessarily will you develop your faculties because they serve you and were given to you for many purposes. So he says it's fundamentally irrational to not will that you develop your talents. Now, again, people think that he's kind of cheating here because his test should be, can you will this as universal law? And it would seem that generally people could, that if someone has a talent that can make them useful, but they'd rather not put the pains into developing it because things are fine as they are for them, we may say, what a waste, what a shame, but we'd probably be inclined not to say that they were, a bad person. A possible exception might be, going back to the COVID case, if someone was working and they were just short of creating a vaccine against the coronavirus, and they won the lottery and well, screw this, I'm stopping. You might say in that case, yeah, that would be actually morally wrong because they should finish it. But in general, we would say that, yeah, maybe that's unfortunate, but we might not want to say that it's actually wrong. And so it comes down to kind of intuitions. Is not being all you can be, would that be not just kind of a waste, but also wrong? Now, given Kant's view, he would say yes, letting your talents not develop would be wrong and absolutely wrong. In case 4, Kant presents what is essentially the parable of the Good Samaritan. In this parable, a person is traveling and falls among thieves who stab them, rob them, and throw them in a ditch. And then as the person lies in the ditch, suffering and bleeding, people just keep on walking by until at last a person from Samaria comes by, pulls him out of the ditch, binds his wounds, brings him to town, takes care of him, gives him some money, and this is where we get the notion of the Good Samaritan. So Kant asks us to imagine the following scenario. There's someone who is in prosperity, someone who's doing very well, and they see other people in wretchedness and suffering. And though they could help them, they decide it's no concern of their own. And their view is that everyone can be as happy as heaven pleases, or as they can make themselves, but they'll do nothing to help them. Now, we can imagine a scenario today like that. We have people who are extremely well off, and during the pandemic, of course, we have people who've lost their jobs, who are having trouble paying rent, and they could definitely use help. And you can imagine someone, in their mansion with their piles of wealth saying, yes, I could help these people, but it's no concern of mine. But they think back to the college class they took in philosophy and kind of wonder, what would Kant say about this with his categorical imperative? So here's what Kant would say. Kant's categorical imperative, of course, involves creating the maxim. And this maxim would be this: when I am very well off and could help others, but don't really want to, no concern of mine, I will not do so. And the universal law would be, when anybody sees people who are not well off, they don't need to help them, even if they're really well off and could easily do so. Now, Kant notes, perhaps a bit cynically, or maybe even slightly sarcastically, that if this was a universal law, that anyone who is well off need not help others, this may be better off than when everyone talks of sympathy and goodwill, and occasionally practices it, but otherwise cheats and betrays or violates the right of others. But then he gets back on track and says, but it is impossible to will that this be a universal law. Why? Well, his reasoning is this. Imagine going back to our person sitting in their mansion with all their wealth, thinking about helping people but deciding not to, and they say no one, need help anyone. So imagine that they suddenly find out that all their stocks are valueless, so their wealth's gone, and they realize that, they live in California, and then so like a fire, catches on, their house catches on fire, and they lose their home and all their money, and they have nothing now. And of course, in that scenario, they would need the help of others. And if this was a law of nature, that, the law of morality, that no one need help others, then he would be, totally out of luck. And so Kant says, because we'd want others to help us, it's right of us to help others. So what Kant is essentially doing is kind of lame science fiction. He asks us to imagine a world that is like ours, but the difference is one small change. So in this world that he's considering, the change would be that instead of it being considered, good to help others in need, it would be morally acceptable to not do so. And Kant thinks that would result in a contradiction. Now, critics of Kant often say that what he's doing here essentially is appealing a bit to consequences, that you should help others because you would want them to help you, and if you are in need, the consequences would be bad, or out of pure self-interest, it would seem. But Kant does conclude that the right thing to do is helping others. So with his 4 examples, suicide for him, wrong and always wrong. Lying promises, wrong, also always wrong. Letting your talents rust, always wrong. And helping others who are in need would be right. And so that's his 4 examples. And next, we continue with another variation of the categorical imperative.